Hello, I am Karenna Gore of the Center for Earth Ethics. Welcome to this program about the ecological costs of war. To address this critical topic, we are fortunate to have a panel that brings together four experts: Doug Weir, Christina Bagaglio Slentz, Olena Melnyk, and Elaine Donderer. My colleague will introduce them in a moment, but I want to begin by saying that we are deeply grateful for their time and really looking forward to their insights. I'd also like to especially thank the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies, the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and the Diocese of San Diego for partnering with the Center for Earth Ethics to make this conversation possible. The Center for Earth Ethics works at the intersection of ecology and ethics, and our main ways of working are education, convening, and movement building. Based at Union Theological Seminary, the center began 10 years ago with a focus on the moral and spiritual dimensions of the climate crisis. One of the things that we have discovered is that it is important to look at the root causes rather than only at the effect. And it is important to see and account for the costs of things, even if our society is not in the habit of doing so. The purpose of CEE is to change the dominant value system from one based on short-term material gain for some people to one based on the long-term health of the whole community of life. Our areas of focus are sustainability and global affairs, environmental and climate justice, Indigenous wisdom, values, and rights, and ecology, spirituality, and faith. All of them are relevant to today's conversation. The issue of the ecological costs of war has long been on our minds at the Center for Earth Ethics, as it no doubt has been on many of yours. You all who are here listening today, making this webinar meaningful and powerful by your presence. Even though we can't see all of you, we feel that and we're grateful. The suffering that comes from the violence of warfare includes that which is inflicted on air, water, land, and other species of life, both because of the eventual impact on humans that has and because of the intrinsic moral significance of it. War, militarism, and environmental destruction often impact the most vulnerable communities and ecosystems the most. From the poison of Agent Orange in Vietnam to nuclear weapons testing in the South Pacific and on indigenous territories in the US Southwest, to accumulated greenhouse gas emissions that have very real impacts, to Ukraine's worst fire season on record last year, intensified by explosive and overstretched emergency teams and beyond. Our panelists today will explore many aspects and frameworks of this topic, including ecocide, the larger context of Earth ethics and military policy, as well as regional examples of environmental reconstruction after war. We hope that this conversation will provide an educational background on ongoing intertwined humanitarian and environmental crises, as well as highlight the ethical imperative to value the long-term health of all people and the planet. Now, I am delighted to pass it over to my esteemed colleague, Samira Siddique, who has taken the lead in putting this event together and will be moderating the discussion. Samira is Center for Earth Ethics Director of Strategic Initiatives. She has extensive research and advocacy experience on global climate change, global climate justice, including the humanitarian politics of climate adaptation in the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh. Previously, Samira was a Mellon Foundation Fellow in Climate and Inequality at the Climate Museum. She has also been a visiting scholar at the New School's Zolberg Institute on Migration and Mobility and the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. For her research and advocacy work, she was awarded a Public Voices Fellowship with the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and the Op-Ed Project, and a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. She's wonderful to work with, and I'm delighted to hand it over to Samira Siddique.
Thank you so much for that, Karenna. Before I go in and introduce our panelists, I'd just like to give a few more framing statistics about the ecological damage of war and its long-term harm. So, as the Arava Institute, one of our partners today, reports, there are approximately 100,000 cubic meters of sewage and wastewater released onto land in Gaza and into the Mediterranean Sea every day due to the shutdown of treatment facilities. And in Ukraine, roughly 600 square miles of forest have been lost in the first 2 years of war with Russia. Now, in its third year of conflict, over 230 million tons of CO2 emissions have been released. Global military spending was at its highest level in 2024, currently cited by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute at over $2 trillion. The sheer scale of military operations and their environmental impacts is a call to reconsider our priorities. The lens of Earth ethics offers a way to shift towards a global society that values the Earth as a living whole and acknowledges the communities and future generations that are most harmed by ecological destruction. This issue is clearly an urgent and global concern, and we're so grateful to have our panelists with us today to discuss it further. Our first panelist is Elaine Donderer. Elaine is a professional consultant and project manager in the disaster risk reduction and nature-based solution space. Her experience spans research, consulting, and project management across sustainable design, hydrology, and humanitarian action. Elaine has held numerous scholarships in earth sciences and was a former intern at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies. The Arava Institute is an academic and research NGO that established regional environmental cooperation as an effective path to peace building among communities that have been locked in conflict for generations. We are also joined by Dr. Olena Melnyk. Olena is an associate researcher at Bern University of Applied Sciences, an honorary professor at the Royal Agricultural University, and an associate professor at Sumy National Agrarian University. Her research focuses on environmental impact assessments of wartime activities in Ukraine, sustainable resource management, and post-war sustainable development. Since the onset of the war in Ukraine, her projects addressing environmental and conflict-related issues have garnered almost 700,000 euros in support from governments in the UK and Switzerland, as well as from philanthropy and industry. Our next panelist is Dr. Christina Slentz. Christina joined the Diocese of San Diego in July 2022 as the first full-time employee dedicated to directing the Ministry of Creation Care. She brings with her leadership experience from her service in the United States Navy, as well as an academic background on the social impact of environmental degradation. In the spirit of Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical, Christina seeks to bring the issues of environmental degradation and the dire need for good stewardship to light, unpacking dynamics of injustice and systemic forces that drive our estrangement from God, nature, and one another. Finally, we have Doug Weir. Doug has undertaken research and advocacy on the polluting legacy of armed conflicts and military activities since 2005. After working on conflict pollution and the toxic remnants of war for many years, in 2018 he established the nonprofit Conflict and Environment Observatory to monitor and raise awareness of the environmental and derived humanitarian consequences of conflicts. He has contributed to a wide range of domestic, regional, and international initiatives on conflict and the environment, and the Conflict and Environment Observatory's current research focuses on South Sudan and Ukraine. Thank you all so much for being here with us today. And I'd now like to start off the discussion with a question for Doug. Doug, given your global work on environmental impacts of conflict, I'm wondering if you could give us a global context for the environmental harms that are associated with conflicts.
Thanks, Samira, and thanks, Karenna, and thanks for the invitation to contribute today. Yeah, that's a modestly framed question, I think. Um, yeah, I mean, there's different ways of looking at this, and maybe one is kind of the historical, right? That if we go back in time and look towards a point where the environment began being substantially harmed by armed conflicts, it coincided with the industrialization of warfare in World War One. And then from that point onwards, we have had sequences of conflicts, both international armed conflicts and internal armed conflicts, where we have seen very substantial harms to the environment and to components of the environment, to ecosystems upon which species and people depend. Um, and what we have tended to see across time has been these different trends. So, for example, you look at the industrialized death of World War One, going through to the futuristic environmental harm of the Vietnam War with the use of chemical defoliants and napalm, and this sense that a superpower could subdue another country through technological violence, essentially. Then we looked maybe Iran-Iraq War, the first Iraq War, where we have this incredibly polluting context involving huge damage to oil infrastructure, very substantial pollution incidents. Then forward into the wider kind of war on terror and sequences of damage linked to intense militarism, and also intense linked to the actions of non-state actors as well. And then more recently, we have a period at the moment where we have more armed conflicts than at any point since World War II. And when we look across these, whether it's international armed conflicts, whether it's these quasi-international armed conflicts or civil wars, the capacity for environmental harm has only increased. Our awareness and understanding and sensitivity to environmental harm has also increased. And the fact that we're having conversations like this today, and the fact I'm having two more tomorrow, which is no reflection of the quality of my interventions, but more the fact that there is this growing interest and awareness of the environmental dimensions of conflicts and military activities, it shows that there are changes in societies of how we perceive and value the environment, but it also reflects just this onslaught essentially across multiple countries where the environment is bearing the brunt of armed conflicts. And I think certainly in the time that I've been working in this space, we have seen a number of changes. When we look back 15 years, when we were thinking of environmental damage, it would be because the UN Environment Programme had been asked to go into a country to assess the environment after a war and to identify recommendations for what should be done. That was a huge step forward from not looking at the environment, but it meant that we missed a lot of the environmental damage that happened during the conflict if we're only looking at what's there afterwards. Increasingly over the last decade, we've had this ability to monitor environmental harm in near real time using Earth observation, satellite remote sensing, social media, and this is a lot of the work which we do on Ukraine and Sudan. And that has allowed us to get this data into policy spaces. And once you can get that data into policy spaces, then you can start getting action, you can start getting to the media, you can start raising awareness. And I think the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, has been the ultimate extension of this, where we have never seen a conflict with a similarly high environmental profile. And there are really interesting questions around what happens when you have a conflict with an environmental profile, which is that big. There are some kind of key issues and questions in here and sort of ongoing debates and developments. There are big questions around how we document environmental harm in conflict still. We have new tools, but we still can't go there on the ground typically. There are questions around what happens when you have more awareness of environmental damage from a policy level, from an accountability level. There are questions around how we respond to environmental damage from conflict. What is the international system of assistance? What does it look like? What can it do? What are its limitations? And then increasingly, there's questions around accountability in the legal framework, including questions of ecocide. And these are developing debates, and we need clearly more tools to enforce accountability. So I'll maybe stop there before taking up the entire afternoon. But that's a little bit how we kind of see it at the moment.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really comprehensive context setting. We'll get deeper into a lot of that throughout the discussion, so thank you, Doug. Um, Also to the audience who's watching now, I just want to say if you have any questions throughout the program, please drop it into the Q&A box and we'll address it during our Q&A session. Um, so Doug mentioned this idea of ecocide, and I'd like to turn it over now to Olena Melnyk to speak in particular about her experience working on environmental harm in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, in particular, the deliberate attacks on forests, rivers, farmland, and infrastructure have been called ecocide by global experts, for which there is a global movement to be recognized as an international crime alongside genocide and crimes against humanity. And Olena, I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about your personal story fleeing Ukraine and how you've managed to continue your research since the Ukraine conflict and how that's also changed due to the conflict.
Thank you, Samira. So yeah, my life story and fully connected to my research story. Because when the war started, when the war began, I was living in Sumy region. It's just region located in the north part of Ukraine, just 30 kilometers from Russia border. And area was already under the constant attack, under the constant missile attack and artillery shells. And during the first weeks uh, of the war, I decided that I have, together with my children, to flee the country because it was too unsafe. And I was lucky during the first months to get financial support from the Swiss National Science Foundation. And I joined the climate policy lab at ETH Zurich to proceed with my research that I started being an associate professor in Ukraine. And then leaving the country physically, of course, I couldn't leave my university, and my all my thoughts, all my research was still connected somehow with Sumy National Agrarian University, and I kept working as a researcher and as a lecturer remotely for them, and as a head of international projects division. At the time, I had a few projects. Even given the war started, we still we're working under this project, and including one project that was we were closely collaborated with the rural communities, and it was a really hard time for farmers, I would say, because it was a spring 2022, and our region was previously just like a couple weeks ago deoccupied, and then it was a sowing season, had to be started somehow by farmers. And but that time the field in my region had been already littered with ammunition remnants and the bombs and unexploded ordnances, and that caused quite a lot of concerns among farmers about the quality of harvest and its safety. And at the time, farmers requested my colleagues, me exactly, what they should do with their soil. Is it still safe, or it should be somehow remediated, or it should be abandoned? And then we discussed that internally with my colleagues at Sumy National Agrarian University, and they didn't have this experience of working with contaminated by heavy metals, organic metal soils. And then I decided, okay, I can try to involve international community from countries that already passed this way. For example, from France, in Rouge Zone, there were a lot of researchers who were dealing with this zone that for almost 100 years they were withdrawn from agriculture due to high level of pollution. So I created kind of a network from different specialists. Particularly, we had initially we had specialists from Switzerland, ETH Zurich University, Bern University of Applied Science, and Royal Agriculture University in the UK. And we started on the volunteering basis our first soil sampling campaign, and we collected soil samples from 20 farms in 3 regions closely bordered to Russia, in Sumy, Kharkiv, and Chernigiv, and we took that soil samples to Switzerland. I invited my colleagues. We had this kind of workshop together, and these soil samples, they were divided for 3 different uh, between three universities, and they were analyzing that universities by different methodics, using different techniques, different approaches to understand what kind of contamination we can see in our soils. And because before this first soil samples came to us, my colleagues from ETH Zurich, they were quite concerned about the quality and about the level of pollution if we still can use that soil, especially in my region and also part of Ukraine. But when the first soil samples arrived and were had been analyzed, so we understood that, okay, the situation is not that critical as it can be. And there are already a lot of myths in mass media about that, okay, whatever, all commodities, agricultural commodities from Ukraine, they should be somehow banned because it's too poison, too dangerous for the Europe. But Ukraine, before the war started, fed about 400 million people, and we only consumed it for our internal market 25%, and 75% we sent as an external as an import to different countries like China, Asia, and so on. So of course it could cause it already caused rise in prices for food commodities, and we decided to investigate more deeply this topic. So we launched it, and we also understood the time. So the territory of Ukraine is huge. It's 600,000 square kilometers, and we don't have enough capacity to take soil samples from all parts of Ukraine. And that time we came up with the idea that we have to teach soil specialists in soil sampling, soil analysis, and to use drones, to use different GIS systems for soil sampling and mapping, soil mapping. And that time we decided to invite former soldiers who got back from the front line battlefields, and a lot of them, they had this experience of running drones and experience in agriculture, the peaceful time before the war started. And we invited them, and we launched this company. We invited different lecturers from Switzerland, from the UK, from Ukraine, to teach them how to take soil samples properly, how to analyze the soil samples, how to develop remediation techniques, how to map soil pollution. And we got to about 50 people from almost all regions of Ukraine who now are able and already work for their local governments, local communities, to help to serve for agriculture. And then after that, we were contacted by Syngenta. They wanted our team, to conduct some research for their clients, like for farmers in 5 regions of Ukraine. For them, we took soil samples and developed tailored remediation techniques, exactly given the type of pollution, the level of pollution, and regional climatic conditions, and so on. And although we had a big project with the Hello Trust, for them we analyzed about 2,000 soil samplings from their areas after mine clearance, to understand how mine clearance affect polluted soils. Because when the war started, we had about that 1/3 of the territory of Ukraine potentially mined. So you can imagine just the scale of the problem. And now we're going to analyze soil samples for the Cargill company, and we're about to launch a big sampling company for the Ministry of Environment of the UK. And we are going to georeference polluted areas to develop recommendations for the monitoring system for these areas, just to understand which areas still can be reliable for agriculture and which areas should be withdrawn or should be somehow remediated, so that from the areas should be remediated for the better use in the future and for safe use, I would say. And actually, my topic before the war started was not soil. It was a climate policy and energy security. And now I'm happy that I can get back to this topic now, together with 2 British universities, Sheffield University and Aston University. We're going to apply for another project and the frames of that project, we're going to combine these 2 topics, energy security and soil amendment. So it's about one project about biochar application for both energy decentralization in Sumo region and for soil amendment. And so yeah. So I'm glad that my background somehow can be also applied now to contribute to climate adaptation and mitigation policy.
That's
So it was in a
amazing.
brief.
Thank you so much, Elena. I also want to say that Olena has very wonderful writings that she's published about her work and her time leaving Ukraine and how it's related. And maybe on the back end, we can put in a link to her Nature article that she wrote about this work. So very much related to what Olena is speaking about, there is another conflict that has had significant attention in the world, and that is in Gaza, where there has been extensive long-term environmental harm done as well. And Elaine, you co-authored a report from the Arava Institute about the environmental and humanitarian impacts of the war in Gaza. And I'm wondering if you can give us an overview of the regional environmental impacts of war in the Levant. And in particular, how does the work of the Arava Institute document and address the environmental impacts of war in Gaza specifically?
Thanks, Samira, and also thank you for having me here. It's really an honor. Yeah, I had the pleasure of writing a report last year that we're updating now, so stay tuned. There's going to be a publication soon from the Institute with my colleague Mariam Abdelhai on the environmental humanitarian impacts of the war, which you can find on our website. We can also share a link to that later, I'm sure. As you may know, the war has been going on for 1.5 years now, longer than that. Since March 2nd, effectively all borders to Gaza are closed. So there are no humanitarian or aid supplies entering the strip. Also no people exiting at the moment. And really what stood out to us throughout all the work is that the environment knows no borders. That's where the title comes from. And that the environmental costs are very much interconnected with the humanitarian situation. It's a cycle that becomes quite difficult to break. I think in the beginning, Samira, you mentioned the immense amounts of untreated sewage and wastewater that are currently released into the environment untreated. People have effectively no health or sanitation facilities at the moment, leading to a lot of the untreated sewage as well, not to just go into the soil, but also the Mediterranean Sea, which is largely connected to the fact that there's a lack of fuel and energy supply as well. Water and energy are very much interconnected issues, as you always need electricity to power some kind of treatment plant or purification system. So that has been really a dire situation, and one of the main examples of how this also impacts wildlife. It's a very important, for example, station for migratory birds that travel from Africa to Europe and the other way around. But it's also important because if we don't address some of these environmental issues, like Olena put it really nicely with the soil example, it also reduces our capacity to deal with other hazards or disasters like drought or food security have been long-standing issues in the region long before October 7th, and they are becoming exacerbated through the destruction and degradation of the environment, which also has externalities that are a global issue, right? I think Doug mentioned it, like now we have more attention on military emissions. And at the same time, we have wars that continue happening. I think it was the Palestinian officials that said at COP29 that what is this paradox of we're on the one hand addressing all these climate issues and making big investments, but at the same time, we're not accounting for war and not finding better diplomatic solutions to armed conflict. So I think that's where the work of the Arava Institute becomes incredibly important, because again, also long before the war, they've always advocated for shared ecosystems to protect both people and the environment. And it's only been through their long-standing interethnic and also transboundary relationships in the region that they were able to establish humanitarian aid and environmental projects in Gaza since October 7th. So I think a lot of people may find it a bit wishy-washy or watered down to say that dialogue is important and that sharing different perspectives is important for peace dialogue. But the Institute has really shown that that methodology that they're using has, in the end, led to a successful project, which is called Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza, which is a consortium of different regional partners, but also Gazans and Gazan NGOs that have been working also on environmental issues for decades. And they also say they wouldn't have collaborated, hadn't this relationship already been pre-established, because trust is such a scarce resource in a war setting. So I think what really comes out here as well is that you need the legitimacy and you need the involvement of local communities that are stewards of their environment, that often have the best knowledge, like the farmers that Olena mentioned, that immediately notice there might be a problem, like these are the people you need to speak to. And what the Institute is doing as an early adaptation or a way of addressing all of the horror we're seeing really is they are providing different decentralized technologies and also small dignity packs to people in Gaza. So they are building a green camp, which means that basically we're already noticing that people are being underserved, they're not being recognized. Now you have all these news of it being fully occupied, where what we want to promote is self-sufficiency for Palestinians. And we do that through, for instance, providing nature-based solutions like water treatment plants through biofiltration systems. We have another company from the Gazans, which is called Water Gen, which generates potable water from atmospheric moisture. We have more circularity-based approaches where we prioritize place-based solutions and local small and also female entrepreneurs, like, for example, building new construction materials from the rubble that is already there. But obviously, a lot of our solutions are currently on hold at the border since there's no aid entering the strip. And yeah, I'd be happy to talk more about that and the data necessities that we have for rebuilding.
Thank you so much, Elaine. We'll definitely get a bit deeper into those campaigns you mentioned, and that's amazing work that you've highlighted that is happening in that region. Now, a theme that has been running through this discussion so far is that of militarism, and I'd love to bring in Christina into the discussion. Given Christina's experience in the US Navy and now based at a faith-based organization, I'm wondering, Christina, how do you understand the moral tension between the US military's aim to address climate change and environmental harms, but still be able to emit the equivalent CO2 emissions to the total emissions from the country of Sweden? How do we account for that tension within the military and it being the cause of such harm globally? And I'm wondering if your time in the military has shaped your understanding of this tension, and if you could share an example of that.
Sure, Samira. So thank you so much for letting me join you. And you all really have offered up that ground level truth about war that I think for a lot of us in the United States is a really distant kind of experience. We have never really, since the Civil War, experienced war here, and recognizing like what happens is something that most Americans really can't engage with easily. And, so I've given some thought, kind of reflecting on that experience as a naval officer and as one who studied conflict and cooperation in the academic world, and now doing the faith-based work to engage with the environmental crisis, really in the interest of human flourishing. I appreciate today's effort to increase our awareness of the issue of ecocide. So first of all, I think I should say, that currently the U.S. doesn't operate, the military doesn't operate with the intention of using ecocide as a weapon of war that we may have seen in the past. But that's not to say that the environment isn't harmed. And I think we have to really engage with this nuanced discussion in order to get into that space. I think that we have an attitude probably that exists that, might for right makes right. And this observes environmental harm in the course of military operations as something like collateral damage. I have to dump the trash overboard, from the ship because I'm performing my duty of service, or I have to dump jet fuel in order to make my plane light enough to catch the wire on the aircraft carrier because it's just part of the physics of performing my mission and getting everyone home safely. But, we use phrases like Pax Romana, Pax Americana to describe periods of so-called peace that are provided by these kinds of behaviors. But this isn't really a positive peace. It's a negative peace. So stability, may achieve some level of a lack of war, but it isn't a sense of providing an atmosphere where all people can live to their fullest potential. And, in the Catholic Church, that's something that we're saying, we're called so that all are able to flourish and live with dignity. So, as you mentioned, there are some significant costs to these operations. The DoD is the world's 55th largest would be the world's 55th largest CO2 emitter if it were a country. We know that militaries worldwide account for 5.5% of global emissions. And, when we take history into consideration, the United States impact is even greater. The operations we conduct and wars we wage to ensure continued access to and control of energy systems also drive greater fossil fuel consumption. During Iraq and Afghanistan wars, only a third of the emissions connected to the U.S. military were related to these major zones of operation. The rest were simply the other stability operations that are happening around the planet. So I think, as you kind of alluded to, there's an irony in these dynamics that there is an increasing national security concern in the United States that observes climate change as a threat multiplier. But in theory, that means that the United States is contributing to the very causal factor that is raising their alarm. And I recognize, there's a lot of debate in the securitization of the climate. And I do reject that kind of alarmism and the dismissal of human agency. But I do think it's also important for us to recognize significant human insecurity that is increasing vulnerability around the world, especially for those who are least responsible for climate change. So, if the military is meant to be a global force for good, giving rise to such conditions is antithetical to the mission. All of this said, I do have my own kind of moment of being confronted by a rejection of some of these, military stability operations. I was attending a UN Women's Conference in DC in 2015, and, everyone was kind of down with militarism and the patriarchy, and I was right there with them. And 4 women from Afghanistan stood up and said, "Do you know what will happen to us when the military leaves?" And the room really just went silent. And, I do keep that with me because 3 months later, a colleague of mine from graduate school, was killed by a terrorist attack in his professor office at American University in Kabul. And then a few years later, when the US did pull out of Afghanistan, the woman he had introduced to me as his fiance, she had to flee, and she had worked extensively in women's education and, was very much a target. And, for 3 weeks, I was, just hoping and praying that she made it out before I finally learned that she did. And so I think we wrestle with these dynamics. This is not a new problem. Ancient philosophers, Cicero, St. Augustine, wrote about the idea of a just war theory following the Rwandan genocide. The United Nations, has promoted the idea of a responsibility to protect. And this kind of implies that security forces are an unfortunate part of our world. But I think we have to think about how hard we work to train as a military or to perform these operations, and how hard do we work to train towards peace, right? So we put a lot of effort, a lot of money, and we are putting a lot of emissions into the world in an effort to produce a stability that may not really provide that human flourishing that we seek. This year, the Christian community is celebrating the season of creation with the theme Peace with Creation. For us, we believe that the greatest commandment that Jesus gave was to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. And many capture this with the golden rule, right? Treat others as you would want to be treated. And, we lived in a globalized world, and our actions have a global impact. So when we think about those actions at a global scale, we are simply demonstrating this love of neighbor at global scale, or the golden rule in a scaled up version. So I think I would just kind of close out with a couple of thoughts on, putting more effort into soft power, which is something we've moved away from. We need to think about policies that foster interdependence, and our foreign aid is a lot of bang for the buck. So this actually offers up a lot of efficiency when we look at that in comparison to the costs, both financial and environmental, that are produced by our military operations.
Thank you so much for that, Christina. I think you really brought in even more complexity into this conversation. I really appreciate that. Now, building off of what you're saying about the role and scale of US militarism and the nuances there, I want to pivot a little bit back to Olena. Actually, there's been a lot of media coverage about the US funding mechanisms for Ukraine. And I'm wondering, what does the rollback of this aid look like on the ground, and why does that matter?
Thank you for the question. It's a very, very interesting and very kind of hot question, because as Ukrainian, I can say that for many, many years, dozens of years, we used to consider America as a big friend of Ukraine, that always supported us and gave us the shelter for financial availability to provide reforms. For example, reforms of decentralization. There's a huge reform launched in Ukraine in 2015. And then it's always supported independent journalists. And and climate policy, so many projects have been implemented under the support of American government. And of course, for agricultural sphere. And it was quite a shock for us when all the kind of governmental support have been terminated. And then, of course, if we are talking about agriculture, so it's particularly affected that USAID, all financial support from USAID has been cut. And for agricultural sector, what does it mean for them? First of all, it termination of government development programs. For example, programs that were focused on irrigation systems and land reforms. Because probably you know that before the war started, we kind of launched in Ukraine a huge land reform, and we really significantly relied on US support, financial support, to develop this program, to develop this reform in Ukraine. And of course, the second problem is the loss of access to essential inputs because Ukraine provided, USA provided Ukrainian farmers with seeds, fertilizers, and of course with financial support, assisting up to a third of our farmers, especially from war-affected regions since 2022. And the third problem is delays in delivery of critical equipment and resources. Because before this termination, our farmers already were waiting equipment that had already been funded through the youth aid and their own financial contributions. And this suspension of funding led to significant delivery delays, of course, negatively affecting their operations. But I would say one of the most critical areas affected by the withdrawal of the US support is the demining of agricultural land, which is essential for enabling the safe return to farming and in liberated and conflict-affected regions. USAID has been supporting organization for responsible for surveying, marking hazardous areas, and physically removing explosive remnants of war. And following of this suspension of funding, many field operations were shut down, significantly slowing the clearance of thousands of hectares. Of course, we have different types of demining organizations that have been operating in Ukraine, but they also need some financial support and significant support we received before from the USA. And this has put a full-scale sowing campaign this springtime under huge risk, and now it possesses threat to food security at both local and even national level. I would say even international level. So farmers lack the authority and resources to carry out demining themselves, and without official clearance, insurance campaigns and state support programs, they refuse to provide any assistance or compensations. That is why, I think we all now have to unite and, I don't know, to raise our voice. And I still hope that this financial aid can be returned back, because without that, all farmers in Ukraine and agriculture in total will be staying under the huge risk of surviving, I would say even.
Thank you so much for going into that. And I'm so glad you mentioned the issue of food systems, because it's not just that these conflicts are happening in one particular place. They have international, regional effects that really sprawl out. So that's I think Elaine said it earlier, the environment knows no borders, and food systems is a really important example of that. Now, pivoting a little bit, we've kind of touched on this deeper philosophical question that I want to get into here. And if I may, I want to bring in my own research a little bit into the Rohingya refugee camps in Bangladesh, where there was an influx of 1 million refugees into a forested area of Bangladesh, which led to mass deforestation and is an example of the ecological cost of conflict. And this deforestation event was used by the UN to advocate for more sustainable technologies like solar lights and solar panels in the refugee camps to reduce harms to the environment. But that was done in lieu of a broader advocacy for human rights in those contexts. So this relates to this broader debate around how do we actually account for balancing the rights of nature with the rights of human beings. And we've been kind of dancing around this, but I'm wondering, Christina, if you could speak a little bit more about that tension that we feel here.
Yes, I guess, one of our most prominent examples in the Catholic faith tradition is Saint Francis of Assisi, who recognizes that all of the created world is interconnected, and if it's all created by the same divine architect, right, then therefore all have a sibling relationship, a fraternal relationship with each other, and that includes the environment, right? So we understand that that it the relationship of or the preservation of one is not minimized, for the benefit of the other, right? That we actually depend upon all of the created world or all of nature to be supported ourselves. All life, is interconnected. And this is a big theme of Pope Francis's encyclical that he wrote in 2015 called Laudato Si, which Laudato Si is quoting Saint Francis of Assisi, and gives a nod to that understanding that the integral human flourishing is dependent upon recognizing an integral ecology, and that humans are part of nature. I don't know if I hope that answered your question a little bit.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I want to bring in Doug here because Doug, you've done a fair amount of work on international legal mechanisms around this issue. And if you could speak a bit about the anthropocentrism that we see within those frameworks and how the environment is often a silent victim there.
Yeah, thanks, Samira. Yeah, there's numerous ways of looking at this. I think when you look at it from the perspective of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, um, they are deeply anthropocentric, have been, it wasn't until the post-Vietnam era where developed the initial bit of international humanitarian law, which addresses the environment in a kind of meaningful way. And even now, the bulk of it relates to human impacts. Now, obviously, it's argued that the environment is a civilian object, unless it becomes a military object under international law. But even still, the protections which are granted are considerably weaker than those for protection of people. And I guess it just speaks to this whole sort of spectrum, I guess, of how we perceive environmental values in relation to conflict. I remember when we just after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and we were documenting incidents of environmental damage, and we were getting tweets back saying, "Why on earth are you caring about the environment? There's a war going on, people are dying." And it's like, it's unfortunate that we still haven't quite reached the stage where people recognize that people and the environment are intrinsically linked. On in many respects, it seems fairly obvious. If you try breathing, or if you drink, or if you want to eat something, for example, the environment is pretty fundamental to these basic human actions of survival. And while we've seen sort of significant steps forward in terms of the right to a healthy environment under human rights law and this merging of the environment and human rights, there's still this kind of step we as individuals need to take in terms of how we understand and perceive these things. And it's interesting, we see this problem everywhere we look. When we look at the humanitarian sector operates under these different clusters. You have a cluster on shelter, you have a cluster on protection, you have a cluster on water and sanitation. But they don't really approach the environment as a cross-cutting issue across all of these things. It's like, what are you going to build your shelter out of? What's the state of the water that you're using for your water and sanitation systems? And because we have kind of failed to make these connections, there has been this sort of late attempt to try and promote the environment and mainstream the environment in these contexts. Whether it's in the humanitarian sector, we work a lot with organizations clearing landmines who have also been on a journey to try and address the environment in respect to what they do, which has typically previously focused just on risks to people from things exploding and not addressing the environmental consequences like soil contamination, like damage to soils after you clear using mechanical demining, like the opportunities that are created once you've cleared land to then integrate nature-based solutions, which might increase the climate resilience or biodiversity value of these areas, thus protecting and supporting local communities and livelihoods. So we're still way behind on making these connections. There's been a lot of progress in these spaces, but it all goes down to this question of how we perceive and how we react to conflicts when we think it's just about the human story, and it's not. The human story and environmental and ecological stories are intrinsically linked, and we have to start approaching them in this way.
Thank you, Doug. There is also a broader question here of how we can even calculate or assess environmental harm. And I know this came up a little bit earlier in the discussion, but I want to get a little bit deeper into that. So how do we even decide who is responsible for that? There is an overall lack of documentation and data on this issue. And I'm wondering if Elaine, you can speak a little bit more to that tension and that the use of data and documentation here.
Yeah, I think what's dangerous here is like the power of the sensational. Like I think Doug mentioned this also in our previous discussion, there are actually many wars ongoing or military activities that destruct the environment in more areas than just Ukraine and Gaza, but they're not as sensationalized. And thus there's little to no data on these contexts. And even in Gaza, like what I've just noticed in the past 2 years is that there was a big upsurge in data and also more accredited sources, and it just became gradually less and less. And even organizations whose mandate it is to provide such information are just slacking a little bit behind, just waiting for the moment where it's safe enough to do more field-based studies like Olena was talking about with soil samples and water samples, but it's just really restricted to get that access and the data. And it's always a question of who is obviously the owner of that data. I think sometimes there's also the pitfall of international organizations maybe even using localized data sets or from national ministries even, and not crediting it properly, not literally like referencing it properly. And so there's also this disconnect between really acknowledging data ownership and why it's important for local populations to have their own narrative. I think especially in a context like Gaza, I mean, I'm part of it. I'm an outsider looking inside. And all I will have is to rely on the literature and remote sensing and things like this. But what we truly need is for Gazans to generate their own data, own it, and use it. And I think there's just not a real focus, or also with the lack of funding right now, it's just really difficult to give focus to issues like that when the immediate need is for water, food, and fuel, obviously.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Elaine. We focused a lot on this conversation on kind of the global context, the US militarism issue, Ukraine and Gaza, and I want to bring in so many other conflicts that are going on in the world that also have environmental harms. And I'm wondering, Doug, if you could speak a little bit more about what we can learn from these particular contexts that we've mentioned for other regions around the world.
Yeah, thanks, Samira. Yeah, I guess there's a few different things to consider. So we look at a range of different conflict areas. So we do quite a lot of work on Yemen. We do quite a lot of work on Sudan. We do a lot of work on Ukraine. And every single one of these conflicts has a different fingerprint almost of environmental harm, depending on the context, be it the societal or development context, or the environmental or geographic context, or how the war's being fought, who's fighting it, where it's being fought, all of these questions. I think what we do see very often is this huge disparity in attention between conflicts. As Elaine has sort of indicated with respect to Gaza and elsewhere, Ukraine it's a really important example for a lot of reasons that, as I said in the opening remarks, we've never had a conflict with this much environmental data coming out of it. And the reasons for this are multiple. Obviously, Ukrainian organizations, Ukrainian civil society have been generating data. The nature of the conflict, how it's being fought, some of the incidents we've seen, the high profile ones like the destruction of the Kharkiv Dam, some of these incidents have again focused attention on the environmental narrative. There's also been a lot of work from the Ukrainian government to advocate for the environment and around the damage that's being caused, and this has raised the issue up. And what's really interesting for us now is like, what are the ramifications and implications for that in terms of Ukraine's recovery and post-war reconstruction? To what extent will the environment be part of this and addressed in a meaningful way? And we can see the signs that this is going to happen. But then we look to somewhere like Sudan, which we also work on, and you have 11 million people displaced. It's the world's worst humanitarian crisis. The overall narrative from the war in Sudan has been the lack of media attention. And of course, the point where a lot of the media coverage is about the lack of media attention, such media coverage that there is. The environmental narrative and dimension of this conflict has been pretty much absent from the conversation. And again, there's a few reasons for this. There's the overall lack of attention. There are a lot of Sudanese experts and civil society organizations who have had to transition from their environmental work into humanitarian response because of the nature and intensity of the humanitarian crisis there. Compared to Ukraine, there's been a singular lack of funding or resourcing for environmental work. There have been other issues around the ability to get environmental data out of the conflict and into the public discourse, which I won't go into. But yeah, it's a complicated picture. And then there's this question of, well, if we don't have this environmental narrative of conflict, what happens in terms of the peace, in terms of reconstruction? And one of the key issues for Sudan is that there are environment and resource issues which have been absolutely critical to the security context of Sudan. So we have gold, we have oil, which are fueling the conflict and have done for a long time. Then we have kind of a lower value natural resources like land, like water, which, going back to the conflict in Darfur years ago, these have been triggers for things which have exacerbated communal violence. And so if we don't address the environment in a meaningful way during building peace in Sudan, then it curses Sudan back into the cycle of conflicts. And so we have a war where it is absolutely critical for the peace that we consider the environment. But right now, it's not really on the agenda. And this is a kind of a pattern we see in other places. Myanmar is another good example where we have a lot of issues around natural resources, whether it's minerals, timber, gas, which are really critical to relationships with neighbors, but also critical to how the conflict's being funded and financed and fought. And again, if we're not aware and talking about these narratives, then chances are they won't be addressed post-conflict. And if they're not, then we're kind of stuck in these cycles of violence potentially. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Doug. So we have quite a few questions in the Q&A. I just want to ask one last question, which is about how people can help from afar with all these conflicts going on. That's a common question that comes up when we have discussions like this. And Elaine, you mentioned the Jumpstarting Hope project in Gaza. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that. And then I'll also turn it over to Olena to speak about a project in Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the Jumpstarting Hope in Gaza is special because it's a consortium of local and regional organizations that have been cooperating for a very long time throughout all kinds of political ups and downs. And they are really working on like bringing in decentralized technologies, going directly from not just providing immediate relief, which is still part of the conversation, but thinking already in the long term. We've seen this after 1948. Today is Nakba Remembrance Day, so it's a good occasion to speak about this. Like many people who have been expelled from their homes in 1948 continue to live in refugee camps until today, without proper sanitation, without proper electricity, all of these things. So with that in mind, this consortia developed a range of technologies that can be deployed in the long term to provide decentralized off-grid access to some of these basic needs. But I think in terms of how to support it from the outside, I mean, the US aid funding cuts were also pretty intense for our region. So I think what's most important is mobilizing alternative funding streams. as well as obviously advocating for the continuance of US foreign aid. But I think it's also a good point in time to transform a bit of that landscape. I think it could potentially also have a better outcome. But I think what's important on a personal level would be having space for nuanced thought and holding space for all the contradictions that we have as humans and as individuals, wanting to do good, but then also maybe internally there are some things that we can't reconcile with, and holding space for those contradictions and for grief of all sorts. And in terms of supporting the Institute, obviously come visit, be an intern, work with us, but also donations are very much welcome, and they go really directly to the projects and to the Palestinians we're working with. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out. I think we're very open and big community that's willing to learn. But in terms of helping, I think those 3 points would be most important, really.
Thanks so much, Elaine. And Olena, if you could speak a little bit more about campaigns or projects in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. So I was quite surprised and to see how other governments they kind of exaggerated their efforts to support Ukraine, and they have launched a lot of different types of programs, and I think that some of scientists from around the world they contact me and say, okay, if we can somehow apply our skills, our knowledge, we are ready to work for free. So for example, recently I was contacted by a representative of one American NGO who said to me, so do you need someone who can take soil samples for you for free from different regions, even that ones from where that are very close to our front lines? And there are so many requests from people, from just NGO, from academia to support us. They ask what we can do, how we can help. And of course, I would say that it's very important not to keep silence, raise your voice, even talk about the problem to different types of groups. So here, for example, in Switzerland, I try to talk to everybody, starting from the local, very small community, rural communities, to try to explain, because not everybody understands the impact that agriculture in Ukraine has on the road food safety. So start from talking to rural communities, from general people, general public to government. And it's very important. And then because each voice matters. And if you work in academia, please talk to your students about the problem. So the young generation that should know what's going on in Ukraine and why Ukraine matters. And if you have a chance to invite Ukrainian speakers from different areas to talk from the first hand what's going on now in Ukraine. Of course, yeah, if you have power, talk to your government, ask about support, because now in Ukraine we have an economical collapse, to be frank, and of course without international support, I don't think that we can manage. But that it will impact not only that will affect not only people in Ukraine but people around the world. So the safety of Ukraine is the safety of all the people around the world, I would say.
Thank you so much, Elena. So I think we could get into our Q&A session now. We have a few questions. Pablo says, you have talked about the ecological costs of war, but what's your assessment on the conflict costs of the climate crisis? Are there specific places, maybe some unexpected, where climate pressures will be the main drivers of conflict moving forward? Anyone like to take that?
Happy to pitch in initially. Yeah, I think this is a bit of a problem. Just back to the Christina's point about how, particularly in the US, climate change has been framed as a risk multiplier, and there was a very US-centric reason for that to be done, to try and engage the US military, and then for them to try and engage a skeptical US public and body politic on climate change issues, that if it was seen as a risk, then more action would follow. And I think this focus on climate change as a security risk leads to policy maladaptation I guess that if it's something we can fight, it's a threat. What do we do? Well, if it's going to trigger more conflicts, we need more military, right? We need more military spending. Um, and instead, actually, most of the science, when you look at it, climate change is unlikely to be the single trigger for conflict, maybe a contributing factor, but you might be better off arming up against capitalism, I suspect, which may be the more profound driver in a lot of these cases and a lot of these claims where climate change is put forward as a sole trigger for a conflict. When you look into the facts on the ground, the world is so much more complex than that. And if we use this framing and if we focus on this hard security approach towards climate change, then it means we're not going to be doing the spending where it would really benefit people and really benefit the resilience of communities. So on climate adaptation, for example, particularly in those countries which are fragile already due to conflict, due to inequalities, due to initial impacts of climate change or environmental degradation, arming up against those does not mean spending on militaries, particularly when they're emitting quite a lot of emissions. It means ensuring that they are supported in terms of climate adaptation. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Doug. Christina, did you have more to say about that?
Sure. No, I think we're very much in agreement. I think my own study on this issue really suggests that it's a human insecurity issue. And I think that, kind of to Doug's point, the way that we frame this security aspect of climate impact will direct where we put our money to address what we perceive the threat to be, right? So if we have an alarmism that says, oh, climate migration is going to be, our borders overrun, and now we arm ourselves to the teeth and we build walls and we do all these things, those aren't necessarily the right strategies, when the reality is most people cannot cross a border, an international border, and don't have that capacity. And one of the things I don't think we talk about enough is that there will be many people who will suffer and potentially die where they are because of the climate impacts and the lack of resilience in those fragile locations. So if there is movement within countries that may, probably most likely go to large cities at first, what kind of economic opportunities exist for those people? They're not really, it's not that there's an economic opportunity in those big cities. It's that there's an environmental push to them that is promoting that movement. And so when those people get there, they're going to face really tough circumstances. So the ideal would be that we make it so that people don't have to move in the first place. And, I've been a military family my whole life. Moving is not easy when you have to, find a new job on top of it, or when you have to, potentially learn a new language, or you're going to interact with different cultures. It's even more challenging. And so most people want to stay where they are. We have to make sure that if we are going to fund a response, that it is helping people to be resilient where they live. And that kind of takes us back to all that conversation about USAID. So if you're out there, especially as an American, and you can affect policy, I think it's important that we really push for a return to those methods of fostering stability in our world over, that knee-jerk reaction to turn to the military.
Thank you, Christina. So the next question we have is, in Tigray, Ethiopia, the 2020-2022 war has resulted in extensive ecological devastation, including deforestation, the destruction of soil and water conservation structures, contamination of water, and unregulated gold mining by armed actors and IDPs. How can international frameworks on ecocide and environmental justice be strengthened to address such war-related environmental destruction, especially in regions where access, documentation, and accountability by the scientists are limited due to lack of funds during the post-war crisis? It's a very large question with a lot of the elements we were talking about today. So does anyone want to take that or start us off?
Yeah, maybe I can give a couple of my comments. So yeah, environmental crime in some senses is very difficult to prove in the court because we know it's a case of Kuwait. It's only 6% of all their case. It has been proved that only 6% of money that they applied for, they managed to prove environmental crimes. That is why I would say that now ecocide, criminalization of ecocide at the international level is an issue that never been more urgent. And for example, in Ukraine, and for example, in Europe, European continent, we have 11 countries, including Ukraine, that have already criminalized ecocide. So, for example, in Ukraine, you can be imprisoned for up to from 8 to 15 years for this type of crime. And recently, maybe you know that European Union also approved the strengthening of its directive on protection environmental through criminal law. So actually, it's already make ecocide the part of European legislation. And now we have to make ecocide an international crime. So it also requires establishing a new law or amendment of International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, but it will take a lot of times. For example, changing it, and will take about like 4 or 5 years, and at least 2/3 of majority. It means that 122 countries of 122 countries should approve this amendment to international Rome Statute, and then probably it will give us more chances to prove this ecocide and attach countries as Ukraine and other countries that where we have a lot of ongoing conflicts right now.
Thanks, Olena. So I think we have time for one last question before we end our conversation today. Let's see. So it was mentioned earlier that most of the population of the US has not experienced the direct impacts of war on themselves or their local environments since the US Civil War. Environmental advocates in the US have likewise been insulated from some of the attacks on personhood, finances, and careers that voices can be subjected to in parts of the rest of the world. Is this changing, especially as we cross into systems change discussions? And are there any tips to protecting ourselves and the broader environment? Anyone like to take that one? I don't want to put Christina on the spot as the American here.
Well, I guess I was the one maybe that brought up this lack of exposure in the United States. And I'm not sure if I think the person is asking about the impacts abroad to persons and finances. And I think well, let me just say, that I think there was a little bit of a question about the way that environmentalists in the United States might be insulated from some of these overall dynamics, right? And I'm not sure, maybe others might have more to add, but I think one of the things that the Catholic Church promotes when we talk about a transformation of our economy or our global systems that are producing the climate change effects that we see, is that any transformation has to be a just transformation. So when we think about the financial impact someone might have, let's say if they're working at Exxon or BP or in the fossil fuel industry, right? Is how do we think about what is just for that person too, right? Because that person has a family, or let's say they're in the military, right? And they're following orders. There may be different people that are impacted by our ideas that will experience some hardship as a result. I have a brother-in-law who's a dairy farmer. The rules that the environmental regulations impose upon their behavior can actually add a lot of financial costs and actually can be really dangerous for them to try to perform. So I think having a just transition means that we're taking everyone into consideration. We're thinking about retraining. We're thinking about financing different areas that may provide some support for people that might be requiring some transition away from maybe one industry to another. And then there also are aspects of, technological leaps that we might think about in places. So, perhaps, much of the world doesn't have electricity. We don't even think about that in the United States, right? Everybody has electricity here, but it's their turn to develop. We got to develop. So how do we think about, can we help with their technological leaps so that they go straight to solar and they do have those kind of abundant life positive dynamics where they live without putting an impact onto our climate change dynamics. So I think that it isn't easy. And the one thing I would say is that, it takes a lot of cooperation, but when one player steps out of cooperation, out of self-interest, it's very contagious, right? And then you are going to see others also step out, or maybe they can't even achieve their, economic stability once a big player like the United States falls out of cooperative efforts. So it will take everybody, and no one person or country can make it happen, but there's definitely something that everyone can contribute to doing. And I think that we have to be mindful of everyone involved and that means maybe think about people across the aisle from us and maybe that have had a hard time embracing some of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think we have time for one very last question, so I'll try to be strategic here. Roberto asks, climate change has been identified as a risk for the US in the past, but what about this current administration? They're promoting climate change denial, and in addition, they're weakening or doing away with pro-environmental regulations. How does this factor into this discussion nationally and even internationally? We did touch a bit on this with the decrease in US funding for Ukraine, and I know, Olena, you could speak a bit more to this, but yeah, it sounds like how does this current administration affect this overall discussion, and how do we move forward?
If I can just mention something, yeah, I'm sure I cannot answer the whole question, but it just made me think a lot about our discussion earlier on anthropocentrism and this whole idea of like what we still need to learn and who is being affected by it and who isn't. I think in the US you also have many groups that are very much affected by environmental degradation and that are not as much part of the discussion, maybe like Native Americans, if we just take the North Dakota pipeline example. And I'm just feeling like it's the same thing that's happening now as what Doug said of, oh, we actually need to move more towards like moving away from anthropocentrism and moving more towards conceptualizing ourselves as part of the environment. And funny enough, I feel like we need to reconnect with that. I don't think it's a new ability we need to learn. I think it's something rather going back to who we are as humans in our natural environment. And I think with this administration, this is kind of the risk of further and further dehumanizing and moving away from who we really are in an environment that is so dynamic. And yeah, just as a thought, but surely there's more to that question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Elaine. And we're still getting more questions, but unfortunately, we're hitting the end of our time here. So I just, before turning it back to our executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics, Karenna Gore, I just want to thank you all so much for this really informative and global conversation about the ecological cost of war. And as discussed, this issue is not only central during times of conflict, but before and in times of quote unquote peace as well. We've been encouraged to interrogate militarism, particularly in the US, and how we can build and rebuild systems and societies and improve environmental health in addition to peace. And this requires us to see the interconnections between human well-being and that of nature. And as some of the initiatives shared by the panelists show, there are ways to take action and push for systems change at the local, national, and global levels. And before bringing Karenna back, again, I'd like to thank our panelists as well as our partner organizations, the Arava Institute, Conflict and Environment Observatory, and the Diocese of San Diego. And I also want to thank my wonderful colleagues, Clara Chavez-Ives, Allegra Lovejoy, and Ned Joyner for their research and organization of this program. And now I'd like to welcome back Karenna Gore to close us out here.
Thank you so much, Samira, and thank you to everyone here. Those were excellent questions, and I think it's really a testament to both the timeliness and the importance of this conversation and topic, and also the incredible depth and quality and layers that each of these voices brought to us here today. I want to say something briefly just of feedback, because I felt one thing that was extraordinary about this was that we were able to come to a deeper understanding, both in terms of perceiving this problem and understanding what to do to address it. And in particular, with the perception, I was very much struck that we were able to learn from Olena and her experience on the ground in Ukraine in such a very visceral and detailed way, and from Christina, from bringing perspectives, also including from inside the military in various ways. From Elaine, to hear about the situation in Gaza and to have things come up not only about, for example, water, and how actually the purifying of the water depends on the power systems, and when they go out, that these are the kinds of complexities that come up. But also mentioning migratory birds and feeling that that's able to be in this picture too, as we see fully what is going on. And Doug, in the way that you were able to bring us through some very important history quite quickly around, you know, the reality that a superpower can inflict with the technology such incredible devastation, and how this is a modern reality that's still progressing, and also that it's an onslaught across so many regions. It was very powerful, and then in addressing it. Again, you know, Doug, you're bringing us into just seeing the anthropocentric nature of the laws of war as they've been laid out, and how we can change that mindset, how we need to really practically understand how to document, assess, and pursue accountability, and that this is possible to do, was so powerful. And I felt also from Olena, it was really fascinating to understand, and you really brought us to that place of the soil and what has happened with the contaminants of the soil, and that the people that are engaged in the conflict there are then actively being trained to take the soil samples and focus their attention there, is such a powerful understanding of how this is addressed. And Elaine, I felt that you're bringing in just the fact that when people do donate, in addition, you know, turning your attention to this, and also that you can actually give support, and that will actually go directly to these kinds of efforts on the ground to address the ecological aspects, which of course impact the humanitarian. All of this, and then Christina, in the way that you brought us to the moral and ethical framing from sacred texts and teachings, and also just universal spiritual truths, both specifically mentioning specific thinkers and traditions. but also just allowing us to understand that that itself, that way of thinking, is part of a solution. That in many ways, our way of thinking is what has to change first, and then we can open up so much here in terms of alleviating suffering and pursuing this better world we know is possible. And finally, I just want to say to Samira, you did such a beautiful job putting this together, and I'm so glad that you very briefly mentioned your own research, because it actually opened up a wonderful conversation there around when you were talking about the fact of so many refugees coming among the Rohingya in Bangladesh, that this did lead to deforestation in certain ways, but the way that that was talked about and assessed in some ways brought out the idea of a tension between the rights of human beings and the rights of nature, and then we had such a fulsome discussion of how in many ways the work of our time now is to see that those things are so intertwined, the ecological and humanitarian crises. And I am just deeply grateful to each of you here. I'm glad, Samira, that you also mentioned our wonderful colleagues at the Center for Earth Ethics who helped, and of course, all of our partner organizations. Thank you so much to each and every one of you, and to all who are gathered, and may the conversation and the work continue. Thank you.